In 1894, a German Assyriologist working carefully through a crate of unsorted tablets at the Berlin Museum found one that didn't match anything else in the collection. It wasn't a king list. It wasn't a trade ledger. It wasn't one of the thousands of routine temple receipts that make up most of what survives from ancient Mesopotamia. This one described a procedure, a god, a human subject, and something done to the space between the eyes. The catalog entry called it fragmentary and difficult. For decades, that's where it stayed, half-translated, footnoted in obscure journals, never assembled into a single coherent account. Because once you put the fragments together in order, what they describe is not a myth. It's written like a report. And the god in question is Enki, the one Sumerian texts consistently credit with shaping the human body itself. This is the story of what that tablet says he saw. Before we get into the tablet, you need to understand who Enki was, because the name gets thrown around a lot in this corner of history, and most of it strips away what made him specific. The Sumerians didn't worship one god who did everything. They had a structured pantheon, each deity assigned a domain, and Enki's domain was unusual. He wasn't the storm god or the war god. He was the god of fresh water, wisdom, and crucially, of crafting. In multiple texts, Enki is the one who designs things. He's the architect-engineer of the pantheon. And in the creation narratives that survive, most prominently the Atrahasis epic, he is the deity who proposes and oversees the actual making of human beings, working alongside the birth goddess Ninhursag to produce a being capable of labor. That detail matters because it tells you the role he plays in this specific tablet isn't a stretch. Enki, examining a human body, modifying it, testing it, is consistent with every other surviving reference to him. He's not a war god suddenly playing doctor. This is his department. The tablet itself is cataloged in the Berlin collection, originally pulled from a batch of material acquired from southern Iraq in the late 19th century, the same general wave of excavation that produced most of what we know about Sumerian religious literature. It's badly damaged. Roughly a third of the surface is gone entirely, chipped away by 4,000 years of burial, and another section is so worn the cuneiform is barely legible, even under raking light. What survives is divided into what scholars label as sequential panels, separated by horizontal rule lines, a formatting convention the Sumerians used for structured texts, things like ritual instructions or step-by-step procedures rather than narrative poetry. That formatting choice is part of why this tablet stands out. Sumerian myth is usually written in verse, with repetition and parallel phrasing built for oral recitation. This isn't that. The panel structure reads like a checklist. Each segment opens with a near-identical phrase, roughly translating to "and then," followed by a description of an action. Then an observation. Action, then result. Over and over, across what would have been a much longer original sequence. Of the panels that survive, translators have isolated 7 that form a continuous account. The 7th is the one this video is named for, the one describing what happened when Enki opened something on a human subject's forehead. But the 6 before it set up the procedure, and you need them to understand why the 7th matters at all. The first panel introduces the subject, a man identified only by a generic determinative the Sumerians used for ordinary people. He is brought before Enki at what the text calls the place of fresh water, almost certainly a reference to Eridu, where Enki's temple stood. The second panel describes preparation. The man is washed, then made to lie still, then something is administered that the tablet calls the calming water, a phrase that appears nowhere else in the surviving corpus, which is part of why this fragment drew attention in the first place. Unique vocabulary in a 4,000-year-old technical text is rare, and rare things get noticed. The third and fourth panels are the most damaged, but enough survives to establish that Enki performs an action involving his hands and the subject's skull, repeated 3 times, with a pause described between each repetition. The 5th panel is where the language shifts. Up to this point, the verbs used are physical, concrete, hands-on. In panel 5, the text introduces a word that Assyriologists have struggled to translate cleanly. The closest available rendering is something like the seeing that is not of the eyes. It appears exactly once in the fragment, and it sets up everything that follows. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete decoding of all 7 panels, the tablet numbers, the translated passages, the exact cuneiform sequence for that unique phrase in panel 5, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Panel 6 is short, just 2 lines, but it's the hinge of the whole text. The subject speaks. This is the only point in the surviving fragment where anyone other than Enki has a recorded voice. And what he says, according to the most widely accepted translation, is that he sees the place where the gods walk before they take a body. We'll come back to exactly what that line means, because it's the single most argued over phrase in the entire tablet. But first, Panel 7. Panel 7 is the longest segment in the fragment, and it's also the one with the most disputed translation, because 3 separate research teams, working independently across nearly a century, arrived at meaningfully different readings of the same damaged lines. But the core sequence of events is consistent across all 3. The text describes Enki placing his hand on the subject's forehead, between and slightly above the eyes. Then it uses a verb that in every other Sumerian context means to open a sealed container, a door, or a vessel. The same verb used when a city gate is opened, or a storehouse is unsealed. Here, it's applied to a human body, at a location with no physical opening at all. That's the detail that made this fragment impossible to file away as a routine medical text, because Sumerian medical tablets exist by the hundreds, and they describe real procedures, setting bones, treating fevers, lancing infections. They use precise anatomical vocabulary. This tablet doesn't. It uses the vocabulary of unsealing something that was never physically sealed in the first place. What follows the unsealing is the part most people who've heard of this tablet are actually here for. The subject, according to the text, begins describing what he perceives. And the description is structured almost like a list, each line beginning with the same particle, which gives it that same checklist rhythm we saw in the procedural panels earlier. He describes seeing lines of light connecting distant points. He describes seeing forms that the text calls those who come down, using the same root word that appears in other Sumerian texts referring to the Anunnaki descending from the heavens. He describes a sensation of his vision extending beyond the walls of the room, beyond the city itself, as though the limitation of physical eyesight had simply stopped applying. Then the tablet does something unusual for a Sumerian text. It includes Enki's own reaction. Most Sumerian myth is narrated in third person, detached, observational. Here, embedded in Panel 7, there's a line attributed directly to Enki, and the translation, while contested, generally renders it as some version of, "This one sees as we see." Not as God see, not as the divine sees, as we see. A direct first-person plural, placing Enki and whatever group he's referring to into the same category of perception the subject has just been given access to. That phrase is the center of the entire controversy around this tablet, and it's worth sitting with for a second because of what it implies. If the text is read literally, Enki isn't describing a religious vision or a metaphorical awakening. He's describing the subject gaining access to a mode of perception that Enki and his group already possess as a baseline, not a gift of insight. A capability transfer, the opening of an existing biological function that, in this account, was present but inactive. This is where the tablet connects to something much larger than itself, because Enki's role as the engineer of the human body isn't unique to this fragment. It's consistent across the wider Mesopotamian textual tradition, and that consistency is exactly why this tablet has been taken seriously by researchers who otherwise dismiss most ancient astronaut material outright. In the Atrahasis epic, the most complete creation account to survive from Mesopotamia, humans aren't formed for companionship or worship. They're built for labor, specifically to replace a lower class of deity, the Igigi, who had revolted against the burden of working the land and digging irrigation canals for the Anunnaki. Enki proposes the solution. He directs the mixing of clay with the blood of a slain deity, and Ninhursag carries out the physical shaping. The resulting being is engineered for one purpose: to do the work the gods no longer wanted to do themselves. That's the baseline relationship between Enki and humanity across Sumerian literature. He's not a distant creator. He's the one who designed the model, and by extension, the one who would know exactly what the model was and wasn't capable of from the start, including, presumably, any feature deliberately left dormant in the original specification. If that's the framework, then Panel 7 of this tablet reads less like a myth about religious enlightenment and more like a maintenance log. A designer checking whether a specific feature of his own design could be activated in a unit that, up to that point, hadn't had it switched on. The text never explains why this particular subject was chosen, or why the procedure happened at all rather than simply being included in the original specification from the start. That gap, the unanswered why, is part of what's kept this fragment circulating in research circles instead of being filed away as a curiosity. There's also a detail in panel 7 that doesn't get nearly as much attention as the unsealing itself, and it might be the single most important line in the whole text. After the subject describes what he's perceiving, the tablet records a second action from Enki. He doesn't expand on the experience. He doesn't explain it further. According to the surviving line, he closes it again, sealing back what had just been opened. The same verb from before, but in reverse, the sealing rather than the unsealing. The capability is activated, observed, documented, and then deliberately shut back down. If you're looking for a single line in this entire fragment that raises the most questions, it's that one. Not why he opened it, why he closed it again so quickly, and why no explanation for the closing survives anywhere in the text. Researchers who've spent time with this fragment tend to split into roughly two camps on that question, and where you land usually depends on how much weight you give to a separate set of texts we haven't looked at yet. The ones describing Enki's relationship with his half-sister Ninhursag, and the limits the wider pantheon placed on what either of them was allowed to give humanity. That relationship, and the boundaries built into it, turns out to be the missing piece that makes the resealing make sense. Before we move on to that, stop for a second. What you just heard about the closing in panel 7 is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Sumerian notation, the exact verb pair for unsealing and resealing, side by side, the way the tablet actually presents it. It's all in the document link below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Ninhursag doesn't appear by name in the surviving lines of this specific tablet, but she's central to almost every other text describing the creation and modification of human beings, and her absence here is conspicuous enough that several translators have flagged it directly. In the broader creation tradition, she's the one who actually shapes the clay, the one with hands-on responsibility for the physical form humans take. Enki provides direction and materials. She executes. If this tablet describes a modification happening without her, performed by Enki alone, that would represent a deviation from the standard pattern, and Sumerian religious texts are not generally casual about who performs which ritual or technical act. Roles are specific. Authority is specific. A solo procedure performed outside the normal division of labor reads as something closer to unauthorized, or at minimum, irregular. That irregularity might explain the resealing. One interpretation, favored by researchers who treat the ancient astronaut framework as a literal description rather than mythological metaphor, is that Enki was testing something he wasn't supposed to test, on a subject who wasn't supposed to receive it, and the closing wasn't a procedural step. It was damage control. Activate it, observe what happens, then shut it down fast before anyone else found out it could be done at all. A more conservative reading, the one you'll find in most academic commentary on this fragment, treats the entire sequence as ritual language rather than literal biological description. In this view, the unsealing and resealing of perception is symbolic, a poetic structure representing initiation into restricted religious knowledge, with the third eye imagery functioning the same way it does in numerous other ancient traditions, as a metaphor for insight rather than an actual physiological structure. Mesopotamian religious texts are dense with this kind of symbolic language elsewhere, so this reading isn't a stretch. The counterargument from researchers who reject it is narrower and more specific, that the procedural, checklist-style formatting of this particular tablet doesn't match how the Sumerians wrote symbolic or ritual poetry anywhere else in the surviving corpus. Myth was written one way, procedure was written another. This tablet is written like the second one, and that stylistic mismatch is the detail the purely symbolic reading has the hardest time accounting for. What makes this debate harder to settle than most is that the third eye concept this tablet seems to describe didn't stay contained to Mesopotamia. The same basic idea, a dormant perceptual capacity located at the center of the forehead, capable of being activated through some kind of intervention, shows up independently in cultures with no direct contact with Sumer. Ancient Egyptian texts reference the Eye of Horus in terms that go beyond simple symbolism, tied to specific anatomical correlates that some researchers have linked to the pineal gland. Vedic tradition in India describes the Ajna chakra in almost identical functional terms, a center of perception beyond ordinary sight, located in the same physical position. Separated by thousands of miles and centuries of development, with no clear line of cultural transmission between them, multiple ancient civilizations converged on the same idea, located at the same point on the human body. Convergence like that gets explained two different ways depending on who you ask. The conventional explanation is that human neurology is the same everywhere, so independent cultures arrived at similar symbolic frameworks because they were working with the same brain. The pineal gland really does sit roughly behind that point on the forehead. It really was largely a mystery to ancient anatomists, calcified, deep inside the skull, resistant to easy dissection. A structure that mysterious, located in a meaningful spot, was bound to attract similar mythology across unconnected cultures, simply because the underlying biology gave them similar raw material to work with. The alternative explanation, the one this video's subject matter leans toward, is that the convergence isn't coincidental at all. That if multiple early civilizations describe contact with the same category of non-human beings, beings credited with shaping the human body in the first place, then a shared technical concept showing up across unconnected cultures isn't surprising. It's exactly what you'd expect if the source of that concept wasn't local to any one of them. The pineal gland itself adds a strange wrinkle to this whole discussion, because modern neuroscience didn't fully understand it until surprisingly recently. For most of medical history, it was treated as a functionless remnant, a structure with no clear purpose, which is exactly the kind of vacuum that invites speculation. Then research through the 20th century established that it does something specific. It produces melatonin, and it regulates the body's response to light and dark, functioning as a kind of internal clock tied directly to perception of the environment. In some non-mammalian species, fish, amphibians, certain reptiles, the structure is even more directly tied to light detection, sometimes called a parietal eye, capable of registering brightness even though it isn't a visual organ in the way eyes are. In humans, that direct light-sensing function is considered vestigial, present in early embryonic development before becoming internalized and losing direct exposure to light. That word, vestigial, is doing a lot of work in mainstream descriptions of the gland, and it's the word researchers in this space push back on hardest. A vestigial structure is assumed to have lost its function over evolutionary time. The alternative read, consistent with this tablet, is that it isn't vestigial at all. It's dormant, present, intact, structurally capable, simply not activated under normal developmental conditions. The difference between vestigial and dormant is the entire argument in miniature. One implies something broken down by time, the other implies something switched off on purpose. Now to the history of the tablet itself, because how this fragment was treated after its discovery is almost as revealing as what it says. After the initial cataloging in 1894, the tablet sat largely unexamined for nearly 2 decades. The Assyriologist who first flagged it noted in a private letter, later published as part of an academic archive, that he considered the procedural panels too strange to publish without further corroborating material that, as far as the historical record shows, never surfaced. In 1911, a second researcher took up the fragment as part of a broader survey of Eridu-associated texts, and it was this second pass that produced the translation of Panel 5's unique phrase, "the seeing that is not of the eyes." That researcher's notes describe consulting with colleagues about whether the translation was even correct, given how unusual the vocabulary was, and ultimately publishing it with explicit caveats about uncertainty. The tablet resurfaced again in academic discussion during the 1960s, this time in connection with a wider reassessment of Sumerian medical and ritual texts being conducted by a team working out of a major European university. Their conclusion, published in a specialist journal with limited circulation, favored the symbolic interpretation, the reading where the entire procedure represents religious initiation rather than literal physiological intervention. That conclusion became the closest thing to a consensus position the tablet has ever had, and it's the position you'll find repeated in the handful of textbooks that mention the fragment at all. But consensus in a field this small, working from a single damaged source with no comparable parallel text to cross-reference, is a fragile thing. A handful of researchers disagreeing in print isn't the same as a settled question. It's a settled question only because almost no one outside a narrow specialist circle has ever had reason to look closely enough to disagree. So where does that leave the question this entire video is built around? What did Enki actually see? And what does it mean that the text frames it as something he already had access to himself? If you take the tablet at its most literal, the implication is specific and uncomfortable. Humanity, as built, came with a feature that wasn't included in the standard release. Something present in the design but switched off, accessible only through external intervention by the same entity credited with the design in the first place. And that single subject in Panel 7, the unnamed man who briefly saw what Enki saw, had it switched back off again almost immediately, with no explanation recorded for why he, specifically, was chosen, or why the access was so quickly revoked. That detail, the revocation, is what keeps this fragment relevant beyond its value as a historical curiosity. Because if the procedural framing is accurate, then this isn't a story about ancient humans inventing a metaphor for spiritual insight. It's a story about a capability that was demonstrated to exist, observed directly by the one entity with the authority and the knowledge to confirm it was real, and then deliberately withheld. Every other version of the third eye concept that developed afterward, across Egypt, across the Indian subcontinent, across countless mystery traditions that followed, would in that reading be cultural memory of something humanity once briefly had and then lost again? Not through forgetting, but through a decision made by someone else. Whether you read the tablet as literal procedure or as ritual metaphor wrapped in unusually procedural language, the fact remains that this is one of the only Sumerian texts that frames human perceptual limitation as a choice rather than a given. Not something humans were simply born without. Something humans were born with and then had taken away, on purpose, by the same hands that built them. That reframing, design rather than absence, restriction rather than limitation, is what separates this tablet from every other piece of Mesopotamian religious literature describing the human condition. Most ancient texts treat human limitation as natural, as the baseline condition of mortal existence next to divine perfection. This one treats it as engineered, and engineered things can, in theory, be re-engineered. That's where the fragment ends, as far as anyone has been able to reconstruct it. No record of what happened to the subject afterward. No indication of whether the procedure was ever repeated. Just a sealed door, in a body, closed by the same hand that opened it, and a 4,000-year gap between that moment and a museum shelf in Berlin, where a researcher with no idea what he'd found wrote the word fragmentary in a catalog and moved on to the next crate. If this is the kind of history that actually gets left out of the textbooks, you already know there's more of it. I put together the full breakdown of every panel on this tablet, side by side with the original transliteration, in the document linked below. It's free, it's linked in the description, and the QR code is on screen right now. Go grab it before you forget. And if you want the next one of these, the moment it drops, you know what to do.